para o pessoal ir conectando. Então, em primeiro lugar, eu quero dizer bem-vindos. Essa é uma série de webinars que o GFI começa a inaugurar a partir de agora. Esses webinars eles são voltados ao público científico, então a gente está falando bastante a respeito das tecnologias que vão embasar o crescimento da indústria de produtos plant-based e também de cultivated meat para o futuro. A gente quer com isso trazer realmente um compartilhamento de informações, então abrir a cabeça de todo mundo que está trabalhando com isso, de que existem outras tecnologias, que existem novos métodos, que existem outras coisas que a gente pode fazer também a partir da ciência, da tecnologia e da inovação. Eu vou contar um pouquinho para vocês a respeito do GFI e também de quem é o nosso time hoje aqui no Brasil, e depois eu passo para a Caterine. Eu diria que a maior parte de vocês vai estar enxergando a pessoa que estiver falando. Então, nesse momento eu estou falando, vai ser a minha cara que está apresentando para a maior parte de vocês, mas a gente está aqui também com a apresentação e tem mais outras pessoas online. Então, a nossa primeira apresentação está começando agora, dessa série de webinars. Para quem ainda não conhece, o The Good Food Institute é um instituto que trabalha para desenvolver a indústria de proteínas alternativas. Então, a gente está aqui muito para conseguir fazer com que essa indústria dê certo. A gente é uma associação sem fins lucrativos e a gente trabalha para todo mundo desse setor realmente, fazendo essa coisa acontecer, porque existe uma série de impactos que são necessários, que são urgentes para o desenvolvimento dessa indústria. A gente está falando em questões sociais de como alimentar uma população que vai ser de quase 10 bilhões de pessoas. A gente está falando em mitigar impactos ambientais, em evitar novas pandemias, em realmente combater a fome através de novas possibilidades de se fazer proteína e através de novas possibilidades de se fazer carne. O GFI tem uma tese de que a gente vai conseguir realmente colocar esses produtos na alimentação das pessoas se a gente conseguir entregar a mesma comida que todo mundo está acostumado a comer. Porque comida é tradição, ela envolve os nossos hábitos, a receita que o meu pai fazia, a receita que a minha avó cozinhava, que eu quero fazer igual. Então, a gente quer fazer a entrega da carne, do leite, dos ovos, da comida que as pessoas estão acostumadas a comer, mas através de uma nova tecnologia. Então, eu posso usar plantas para fazer uma carne, eu posso usar células para fazer uma carne. A pessoa mantém os seus hábitos e tradições alimentares e eu entrego isso com uma tecnologia diferente. Hoje, o David veio aqui para discutir com a gente uma dessas tecnologias. E aí o GFI trabalha atuando em algumas áreas. Então, primeiro, ciência e tecnologia, que é o nosso foco aqui hoje, né? Então, Caterine é a nossa líder da ciência e tecnologia aqui do Brasil e o David global dos Estados Unidos. O nosso objetivo com essa área é promover realmente o campo, então fazer com que tenha mais pesquisa técnica acontecendo. A gente tem uma ferramenta de grant, que é para ajudar realmente a financiar essas pesquisas. Então, a gente abre um edital todos os anos, onde nós financiamos pesquisas de algumas pessoas que são aprovadas nesse edital. E o nosso objetivo aqui é ajudar qualquer universidade, pesquisador, enfim, centro de pesquisa, qualquer pessoa que quiser realmente se envolver na ciência e tecnologia desse setor. Depois a gente tem uma área de inovação, que lida muito com empreendedores e investidores, então ajudando pessoas a abrirem empresas no setor de proteínas alternativas, conseguirem financiamento e realmente serem bem-sucedidas nessas empresas. Nós temos um setor de engajamento corporativo, que vai atuar diretamente com a indústria. Então, a gente está falando da indústria de alimentos, da indústria de carne, de leite, de ovos e também das indústrias todas de ingredientes, de transporte, de todas as áreas do varejo, realmente. Então, todas as áreas correlatas à venda de proteínas alternativas. E também temos uma área de políticas públicas, que é a área que atua diretamente com o governo. Então, como que a gente regula esse setor? Quais que têm que ter as taxas e os impostos do setor? Como que o governo investe em ciência e tecnologia? Então, essas são os nossos 4 grandes programas de atuação. Além disso, a gente tem algumas áreas internas, administrativas, de comunicação, etc. Mas aqui são os 4 programas que a gente realmente oferece para o público. O GFI foi criado nos Estados Unidos e hoje, além dos Estados Unidos, a gente tem Brasil, Israel, Índia, Ásia-Pacífico e Europa. Então, uma organização que tem se espalhado pelo mundo inteiro com essa mesma missão de criar uma nova cadeia de produção de alimentos, de se criar outras formas mais inovadoras de se fazer proteína. O nosso time aqui no Brasil hoje conta com esse pessoal que está aqui na tela para vocês. Eu fico muito feliz, inclusive, de poder mostrar esse time, algumas aquisições recentes aqui. Então, eu sou o diretor responsável pelo Brasil. A gente tem a Karine, que é a minha Chief of Staff, que trabalha com a gente aqui, coordenando todas as áreas operacionais do RH. O Felipe é a pessoa que cuida de inovação e pesquisa, então ele lida com empreendedores, investidores e também com as nossas publicações, dados. A Ana Carolina é a pessoa que cuida do nosso development, então da captação de recursos. A Mariana Bernal é a nossa assistente executiva. A Caterine é a pessoa, a nossa Scientific Advisor, responsável pela área de ciência e tecnologia do Brasil. O Cabral, Alexandre Cabral, é a nossa pessoa responsável pela área de políticas públicas. A Raquel é a pessoa que faz corporate engagement, então que faz o trabalho com as grandes empresas. E o Vinícius é o nosso especialista de comunicação, que está entrando no GFI ainda, na verdade, o primeiro dia ainda não foi hoje, mas ele já está no slide que a contratação está fechada. Eu vou passar agora a bola para a Caterine, ela vai falar com vocês a respeito dos próximos 2 slides. Então, lembrando, ela é a pessoa responsável por ciência e tecnologia aqui no Brasil, uma cientista com um currículo invejável, uma pessoa extremamente admirável, uma profissional que a gente é muito, muito orgulhoso e muito feliz de poder ter tido ela com a gente aqui na equipe do GFI. Quero, em primeiro lugar, agradecer ela, porque foi ela que organizou tudo isso, que conseguiu trazer os temas para a gente discutir. Então, Caterine, eu passo a palavra para você. Muito obrigado por organizar o webinar para a gente.
Oi, Gus, eu que agradeço essa abertura, né, as palavras. Que bom que você está com a gente apoiando essa iniciativa. Então, como o Gus comentou, nós temos recebido bastante demanda, né, de assuntos para serem trabalhados do ponto de vista de ciência e tecnologia no campo de proteínas alternativas. Então, a ideia é que esses webinars possam contribuir, né, com as universidades, instituições de pesquisa, mas também com as empresas, aquelas pessoas que querem empreender. E por isso, mensalmente, nós teremos temas variados, né, então, acerca de proteínas alternativas, e que nós vamos ter também palestrantes internacionais e também palestrantes brasileiros aqui para a gente poder trocar um pouquinho de ideias. A gente ainda nem começou o primeiro, o David ainda nem deu a palestra sobre fermentação, e a gente já quer aqui de primeira mão anunciar para vocês o nosso próximo webinar, que vai acontecer então no mês de junho, com um tema bastante interessante, né? Então a questão de textura é um tema que tanto as empresas, as universidades, eles têm bastante interesse, né, em conhecer, em aprofundar, e nesse webinar, então, a gente vai ter a oportunidade de falar um pouquinho sobre uma tecnologia que seria a Share Cell Technology, né, uma tradução ao pé da letra, né, seria tecnologia de células de cisalhamento, e esse vai ser, então, o tema do nosso próximo webinar. Well, so I think now we are ready to start our first webinar. The next slide, Gus, please. So it is with a special excitement that I'm pleased to welcome David Welch to our webinar. So David is the GFI Director of Science and Technology. So David holds a bachelor's degree in biology from the University of California at Berkeley, and a PhD in plant developmental cell biology from Utrecht University. So he has more than 15 years experience in the life science industry, including the product development, market development and commercialization of cells, scaffolds, cell reprogramming tools, and cell culture media. So prepare yourself to be excited and inspired by David today. So David, thank you again for being with us today, and over to you. The virtual stage is yours.
I will stop my share screen and you can share your screen, okay, David?
Okay.
It's free for you.
Yeah. All right. Are you seeing it?
Yes.
Yeah.
Excellent. Thank you so much for the introduction. What GFI does sounds so much better in Portuguese than English, but unfortunately I will have to speak in English today. But it's really nice to be here with everyone. And what I'd like to do for the next 35 minutes or so is talk to you about why I think fermentation is the future of the alternative protein industry. You've already heard from Gus and Catherine what we do at GFI, and one area that, that I focus on and my team focuses on is around white space ideas, or what are the biggest, most important ideas facing this alternative protein industry. And we do this through a lot of analytical work. We involve external industry experts. Some of you on the Zoom call might have even been involved in some of our projects. We take all of that information, we synthesize it to identify these most critical, most high impact ideas, and then share that, that information with the industry. And we use these opportunities really to power everything we do within GFI. They take the shape of technical and commercial case studies and white papers that describe these ideas and what people should be working on in this industry. It informs the grant program and the research that we fund. And you'll be hearing about some of those scientists and their work on the next seminar that Catherine mentioned. They provide a foundation for the technical and commercial information that we provide to companies and governments and universities, and the information I'll be sharing with you today. And ultimately, they help us identify the most important areas of research for research centers around the world to tackle these big problems. And this isn't just a one-directional process where we're pushing this information out. We're really working in a feedback loop where we gather information from experts and exchange ideas to create more and better ideas for everyone to work on. And one big critical question that drives our work and how we think about white space ideas is this question about how we will feed the 10 billion people that are projected to live on this planet by the year 2050 with a food system that is sustainable, efficient, and safe. And as most of you will be aware, the intensive animal agriculture system we rely on today to produce meat and dairy and egg and other products presents some high-level risks for companies and research institutes, governments, and investors. And many of those institutes and organizations are unaware of the serious impact the way we produce meat, fish, and dairy is having on our environment and human health. And you can see a number of examples of this these on this slide here. For example, factory farming produces more greenhouse gas emissions than the entire global transport sector. It's the #1 user of fresh water on the planet. I think we're all aware of some of the deforestation issues with intensive animal agriculture. Many people don't know about the use of antibiotics and the impact that this is having on antimicrobial resistance as well, and some of the foodborne illness issues that this industry is producing. And this in itself can have an enormous financial impact as well. A good example of this, where we have strong data to show the impact, is the swine flu epidemic that has hit the world, and particularly China, over the last couple of years. We saw more than 100 outbreaks in China since August 2018, and about half of China's breeding pigs either died or were culled as a consequence. And then you can see on the left, as the population of pigs decreased, we saw this rapid increase in the price of pork around the world. And so despite these risks and a rising awareness of these risks and the impact that this food industry can have on the planet, the demand for meat shows no signs of slowing down. And in fact, if we look forward to that year 2050, when there'll be close to 10 billion people on the planet, the population is expected to increase by 30%, but the demand for poultry is going to increase by 120%. So a very rapid increase in the amount of meat that the global population is demanding. And a lot of this is due not just to population increase, but also it's correlated with income. So as people obtain more disposable income around the world, their consumption of meat increases, which I think you can see very clearly on this chart here. So we're really going to see, as disposable income increases in countries around the world, greater and greater demand for meat. So what are the solutions? Well, we can tell people to eat more plates of food like this, so a mixture of different types of vegetables. But I think you can all agree with me that this has been tried many, many times by different governments and different organizations around the world with little success. And so to borrow a phrase from Y Combinator, instead of doing that, why don't we make something that people want, but in a more sustainable, more safe way? Can we make meat, but in a better way? And this is already happening today, as I'm sure you're aware. You're seeing evidence of that in Brazil and around the world. And these new products that I'll speak about today aren't being designed for the vegan and vegetarians of the world that make up about 6% of the population. Instead, they're being designed for the omnivores and flexitarians. This is really the target market of these new products, which is clearly a much larger market. These are products that are meant to taste the same or better than conventional meat, egg, and dairy products, to have an even better sensory experience, but meet the sustainability and environmental and ethical goals of these consumers. And because this is such a sizable portion of the market, and that this demographic has a lot of spending power, particularly the millennial generation, the projections for this market are quite optimistic. And I'll give you two examples of forecasts for this market that have been produced in the last year or so. The first is from an organization called A.T. Kearney, and they are taking a very optimistic viewpoint to this industry. In fact, they're projecting that by the year 2040, the combined plant-based and cultivated meat industry will have a 60% market share. So while the entire meat industry, as you can see on this graph, is projected to grow about 3%, once cultivated meat enters the market in, say, 5 to 10 years, we're going to see a really rapid grab of the overall market share, growing from about 20 to 25% in 2030, all the way to 60% in 2040. And we might not meet all of the conditions that are required to get to that point. And this is what this next analysis by another investment organization called Jefferies has shown here. And so even in the case where we have relatively unfavorable conditions, where, for example, there might be regulatory hurdles for these new alternative protein products, or consumer adoption isn't happening as fast as it could, Jefferies is still projecting that this industry will be worth at least $90 billion. But if consumer adoption continues to grow in the way it is, if we see the types of technology advances to create better products and lower cost products that we're expecting, and we see other favorable changes, such as a meat tax, then the size of the industry can be far, far bigger than that. In fact, Jefferies is projecting that this can grow to over 470 billion by the year 2040. So that's enough of a look at the market and where it's likely to go. If it is to get there, what needs to happen from a technology perspective for such growth to happen? And that's really where I think fermentation is going to play a critical role in this industry. So for the remainder of my presentation, I'd like to take a look at why and how fermentation is playing this central role. Well, when we look at alternative proteins at GFI, we put them into three categories, and this is from a production, cost, and infrastructure perspective. One can obtain proteins from plants. You can use fermentation technology, fermenting microbes to produce proteins, or you can use animal cell culture, or so-called cultured or cultivated meat, to produce those proteins. But it's really fermentation that can play this central role, as I mentioned, and where a lot of the growth over the next 10 years and beyond will happen, because fermentation can not only be used to produce standalone protein sources, like you see there on the left, but it can also act as an enabling technology to produce ingredients and other raw materials for both the plant-based or plant protein side of the industry and the cultivated meat side of the industry. And in the future, when all of these different technologies are commercialized, we're likely to see animal product alternatives that occur along a spectrum, from on the left, fully plant-based products like tofu, to fully cultivated or synthetic products on the right, like synthetic gelatin. And in fact, if you're familiar with the Impossible Burger, which I'll speak about in a little bit, this is already an example of this type of hybrid product where the majority of the ingredients come from plants, but it contains within it an ingredient produced through fermentation technology. And we'll speak about that in a bit. So microbial fermentation itself has been used for many years in the food industry to produce ingredients such as enzymes, and it's also been used in the biopharma industry to produce vaccines and drugs and other therapeutics. And this same technology is now being applied to the alternative protein industry and is showing a significant amount of promise that we'll see in subsequent slides. And this slide here gives you a very high-level overview of how companies and scientists around the world are using fermentation to produce proteins. We start with some type of source material. That could be a fungus or a bacteria or an algae. We're optimizing that source material in some way. So we could be genetically modifying it to make it grow better or have certain functional attributes, or we could be breeding it to produce those same types of characteristics. We're then producing more of those cells, and this is where fermentation comes into play. Typically, this is done inside a large tank or fermentation device where we're adding feedstock or fuel that will allow those cells to multiply and grow so that we get many more of them. And then in general, now there are two types of final products that are being produced through this process. The first is protein biomass, where all of the proteins in the cells are isolated and purified to produce an isolate that can be used for alternative meat, egg, or dairy production. Or we're using recombinant protein technology to produce a specific functional protein that can be used as an ingredient. And there are companies innovating on both sides of this today, and this part of the industry is growing very quickly. So on the biomass side, we're seeing companies such as Emergy and Nature's Find in the US produce whole cut products, structured products from filamentous fungi. Even companies like Corn that have been around for a long time that you might be familiar with are starting to innovate more and more in this space. And still on this biomass side, but further down towards the bottom of this slide, there are companies creating protein ingredients as well that could be a substitute, say, for a soy or a wheat protein isolate. And then on the right, we have companies innovating in the functional protein space. So companies like Perfect Day and New Culture producing recombinant dairy proteins, Geltor producing recombinant gelatin, and companies like Motif that have plans to produce many, many types of functional proteins through fermentation technology. So with that in mind, that sort of general overview of what fermentation is within the alternative protein space, what I'd like to do is take an example of a food product and think about how fermentation can be used to create a better version of this. So can we reverse engineer a bacon cheeseburger like the one you see here on this slide using fermentation technology? How can fermentation be used to make a better version of this in the future? Well, if we start with the plant proteins that might provide a foundation for the meat analogs in this product, one of the core questions that drives plant-based meat product development is how do we persuade plant proteins, which are globular and wrapped up in each other, to behave like an animal protein that is stretched out. And this is really what provides the texture. So if you've ever eaten a plant-based meat product and felt that texture as you bit into it, this is in general what has happened, that these product developers have restructured these globular plant proteins so that they become cross-linked and stretched out, much like an animal protein that you would find inside muscle. And today, this can be done through two means, through mechanical means that we process these plant proteins through some type of equipment which restructures them, or we can use chemical or enzymatic means. Today, the majority of the work that's done to restructure these plant proteins is done through mechanical methods, through a piece of equipment called an extruder, which provides high temperature, high pressure, and a lot of water to restructure these proteins so you get that textured plant protein product out at the other end. But we can use enzymes, and more specifically fermentation produce enzymes, to do similar types of things to restructure these plant proteins. And there's already examples of this. And for the sake of time, I won't go into a lot of detail in terms of how this is happening. But this example here is of using a particular cross-linker, an enzyme, to cross-link soy protein to produce a different type of texture. And what you see here on the top right is that when this enzyme is added to the soy protein isolate, you get a harder, so the peak is a little bit higher, you get a harder texture. So this is a great example showing how just by the addition of an enzyme like this, you can link these plant proteins together and cause them to have a different type of texture. So there's now a lot of research happening to figure out which types of enzymes we can use either as the sole method for restructuring these plant proteins, or in combination with a piece of equipment like an extruder or the shear cell technology that Catherine mentioned, to produce better textures for plant-based meat products. And there are a lot of big companies that already create these types of enzymes for other parts of the industry, either the food industry or other industries as well. Companies like DuPont and ADM and Novozymes. And will it be one of these companies that produces the enzymes that this new alternative protein industry needs, or another one? I think here there's a lot of opportunities for innovation for either these companies to do it or for new companies to start to do this type of work. So that's one example, but fermentation can help us address other key sensory challenges, from optimizing flavor and functionality to recapitulating the consumer experience of cooking, providing the aromas that come off a food product as you cook it, and even improving the texture through encapsulating fats and identifying novel ways to bring fats together in these products. But the example I'd like to give you now related to fermentation is coming back to the Impossible Burger that I mentioned before. So on this slide, you can see a list of the ingredients inside the Impossible Burger. Most of them are pretty common ingredients that you might find in other plant-based burgers: soy protein, concentrate and isolate, coconut oil, methyl cellulose, and other starches to bind these proteins and fats together. But on the right there, you can see this soy-like hemoglobin under flavors. So what is soy-like hemoglobin? So like hemoglobin is a globin, which means it's a globe-shaped protein. And these are found both in animals and plants. The one you're probably most familiar with is hemoglobin, which is found in our blood and transports oxygen from your lungs to the rest of your body's tissues through the circulatory system. And hemoglobin also gives blood its reddish color due to the chemical bonds between the ion it carries and the oxygen and how that reflects light. Leg hemoglobin is a plant globin, and soy-like hemoglobin is the variant found on the root nodules of soy plants, which you can see here on the left part of this slide. And there in these root nodules, it cooperates or forms synergistic relationships with colonies of bacteria to convert nitrogen into the forms that plants can use as food. And the active ingredient in globins is a molecule called heme, and it's also found in this version, the soy-like hemoglobin in the root nodules, and it has a red color as well. And when you heat up an Impossible Burger, the leg hemoglobin releases its heme, and you get that same meaty flavor and aroma that you find in beef and other types of animal meat. And originally, the team at Impossible Foods found this and harvested it from root nodules, but then they discovered that it would be far more efficient to do this through fermentation. So they synthesized the or the genetic code for this particular variant of soy lake hemoglobin, and now use yeast, a conventional fermentation process and microorganism, to produce soy lake hemoglobin as an ingredient into the Impossible Burger. So that's a great example of how we can apply fermentation technology to produce novel flavors and novel additives to create better texture and color in these products. But what about cultivated meat that I mentioned at the beginning? This is another area, right, where we could solve the challenge of producing the best beef. How does microbial fermentation play a role in cultivated meat? Well, one of the main challenges that's facing the cultivated meat industry today is cost. How can we bring the cost down so that it's price competitive with conventional meat production? One of the challenges today is the cost of the cell culture media, this nutrient broth that's used to grow the cells and turn them into the cells that make up meat, which is primarily muscle, fat, and connective tissue. Today, if you were to buy a synthetic growth medium from one of the suppliers around the world, you would be paying $300–400 a liter. In order for this industry to be competitive and successful, we're going to need the cost of that media to come down to $1 or less per liter. So a big jump in terms of cost reduction. When we look at the ingredients inside a typical cell culture media formulation, we can see that a lot of the ingredients in these green boxes here are ingredients that we can already source as food grade materials and bring the cost down. So these are not necessarily a challenge for the industry. Where there is a challenge are these growth factors. These are proteins that instruct the cells and tell them what to do, to either stay as a stem cell and divide lots of times, or start to differentiate and turn into the muscle and fat and connective tissue that make up meat. And so a scientist at GFI, Dr. Liz Speck, did an analysis of this. Can we actually reduce the cost of cell culture media down to this range that I mentioned before, to less than $1 a liter? And in fact, at least on paper, we can. We can replace all of these ingredients with food grade versions and bring the cost down. And then when we start to improve the efficiency and figure out new ways to produce these growth factors, these signaling proteins that are so critical for the efficient growth and differentiation of these cells, this is when we can really reduce the cost down to this target below $1 a liter. And how do we make these growth factors today, these synthetic growth factors? These are made typically through microbial fermentation. So we find the genetic sequence of a particular protein that's important for a certain cell type. And then just like with the lake hemoglobin example, we put that into a microbe such as yeast or E. coli and use fermentation technology to efficiently produce lots and lots of that particular protein. And we're already starting to see Liz's paper exercise be applied in the real world. And here's a really nice example of this by a group in Dr. Paul Burridge's lab in the US, where they took some of these ideas and demonstrated that you can indeed reduce the cost of cell culture media by re-engineering these growth factors and producing them in a more efficient way. And they were able to get a 97% cost reduction. So bring the cost of cell culture media down from several $100s a liter to around $10 a liter. So already moving in the direction that I mentioned on the previous slide, down to that $1 a liter. And fermentation is going to play a critical role in this, particularly when you think about the size of this industry in the future and how much cell culture media this industry will need to produce the amount of meat to grab the share of the market that I mentioned earlier in this presentation. So if we think about one bioreactor running semi-continuously, it's going to produce about 175 metric tons of meat per year, cultivated meat per year. But if we want to grab that share of the market by 2030 or 2040 that I mentioned in my introduction to this presentation, we're going to need roughly about 50 million metric tons of cell culture media per year to produce that amount of meat. That's a massive amount of cell culture media. And if you think about those critical growth factors that are an essential part of these synthetic growth medium, you can start to imagine how fermentation is going to be such a critical enabler to this cultivated meat industry. Even if the technology itself isn't producing the actual end product, as inputs into the cultivated meat industry to allow these products to be produced efficiently and at low cost, fermentation is going to play a pivotal role. So I've talked about beef. What about the bacon? Because that's obviously almost as important, right, as the beef when making a bacon cheeseburger. So I hinted at this earlier about some of these new companies that are innovating using the fermentation of filamentous fungi and how they can create a meat-like texture without extensive downstream processing. Corn have been around using microprotein, fermented microprotein for many years, and can already create really interesting textures from their products. But it's these other companies that have emerged in the last year or two that are really exciting, I think. Emergy and Atlas Foods and Nature's Find are all US-based companies, but doing really, really interesting things with filamentous fungi. And you can see there a picture under the Atlas logo, the third image, where they've already produced a bacon prototype. And so this is all very new innovation and research that's happening inside these companies, but we're expecting this to be one of the areas where we'll see bacon and other types of structured meat products like that being released to the market in the coming years. Okay, so we've tackled the beef and the bacon. What about the cheese? How do we produce better alternative cheeses? How does fermentation play a role in this? Well, to tackle this problem, we need to know or understand a little bit about cheese production itself. And on this image, you see a very high-level schematic of the stages of cheese production. So in the primary stage, you have floating inside milk. You have these casein micelles, which are essentially aggregates of dairy proteins, these casein proteins. And a particular casein protein, this kappa casein, has these little hairs that stick out of these micelles. And the first process in this cheese production is the addition of an enzyme called rennet, which today is actually produced through fermentation. And this cleaves off these little hairs, and this allows aggregates to form, these micelle aggregates to form. And this is the first stage in the production of cheese curd. It's like a gel-like formation. And so this has, I think, been one of the main challenges of the plant-based dairy industry, is that these dairy proteins, these casein proteins, have very unique properties where they form these micelles and aggregates and provide the functional characteristics of cheese, like its meltability and its stretchability. So you can either do this by trying to find specific plant proteins and maybe modify them through enzymes, like with the methods I discussed before for plant-based meat, or you can use fermentation in a different way to produce these dairy proteins, these casein proteins, but through recombinant protein technology. And this is what companies like Perfect Day in the US, Legendary in Germany, and New Culture are doing right now. They are synthesizing these four casein proteins through fermentation technology and producing actual casein proteins that are identical to those that you would obtain from bovine milk. And they will have the same functional attributes. And in fact, Perfect Day did a prototype launch of an ice cream last year, which I was fortunate enough to taste, and it tasted just like ice cream. So pretty exciting innovation happening here as well. And another example of how fermentation is going to be really powerful in terms of providing unique ingredients in unique ways to this industry. And so what I think I've shown you here, if you think back to that slide that I described earlier, where you have fully plant-based on the left, and then the spectrum ending with fully cultivated or synthetic products on the right, you can see where fermentation can play a critical role along that entire spectrum. So we can use enzymes to improve protein functionality or coagulation. We can use fermentation to produce new flavoring ingredients like the leg hemoglobin that's used in the Impossible Burger. We can use fermentation to produce growth factors for cultivated meat production. And then we can use fermentation, like in the example from the previous slide, to produce ingredients such as egg proteins or dairy proteins or gelatin. And then the question is really, so all of this is technically possible, and we've seen examples of how this is already being done today. Which of these types of products are likely to come first, and how quickly will this disruption happen? Well, there was a really interesting analysis done by an organization called Rethink X last year that looked at this question, at how quickly and how rapidly can precision fermentation disrupt the food industry. And what you see on the left here is a graph of enzymes or other types of recombinant proteins that have already been launched into the market to replace the same proteins sourced from animals. So a good example that I've already mentioned is rennet, that previously it relied on the use of animals to extract that enzyme. But this is now done almost exclusively through recombinant fermentation methods. And you can see with this red line here how quickly that happened, right? So rennet was launched, and then in the space of a pretty short period of time, it took over the majority of the market. There's great examples outside of the food industry as well, with insulin, where non-animal insulin has almost the entire share of the market now. So this type of disruption can happen very quickly and relies really on three factors. So how complex is the structure of the protein that you're trying to produce through fermentation technology? It's likely in the next 5 to 10 years that more simple proteins will disrupt the market more quickly. How much of the protein do you need? So what type of concentration is needed in the final product? If you require a lot, it's most likely that we're not going to see these types of proteins or recombinant versions of these until later on in the evolution of this industry. And then finally, how scarce is the protein? Is it easy to obtain from animals? We might have to wait a little bit for those. But if it's harder to obtain and it's more scarce and challenging to isolate, then we're likely to see those proteins come on the market sooner. And the big challenge, I think, really facing this fermentation industry is, can we get costs low enough for them to be competitive? And I think, thinking about that previous slide, the answer, it depends on those three factors. But most importantly, how much of it do we need in the final product? So if a product requires 50 or 60% of a recombinant protein, it's unlikely to be taking over the market in the next 5 to 10 years. But if it's been used as a flavoring ingredient like soy leg hemoglobin at low percentages, then we're already seeing success with those on the market, and the price of those final products like the Impossible Burger start to get lower and lower and be even more competitive with conventional animal products. So I started my presentation with a mention of white space ideas, these most important ideas that are interesting for this industry. And I'd like to end my presentation there as well. So what are some of the most important white space ideas and opportunities that we've identified in our work at GFI that can really propel this industry forward, and more specifically this fermentation industry? So there's four I'd like to touch on here that cross both the commercial area of fermentation technology and earlier stage foundational research and development. So if we think about the commercial space first, and the very first stages of fermentation, and I mentioned this earlier on, where we need to find the right host strain, the right microbe, and optimize it in the right way. There are a lot of opportunities here for not just creating novel proteins, but also fats and binders as well. So if you think about some of the functional challenges that exist in this industry of getting the right texture, the right cooking experience for consumers when preparing a plant-based meat product, you need the proteins and fats to interact properly together, just like they would in a conventional animal product. And right now we rely on just a few plant-based fats on the fat side for this, such as coconut fat and palm oil. And there are some really interesting and important opportunities here to look at fermentation technology to produce lipids and binders to create a much better and more sustainable and cost-effective options and inputs for non-protein ingredients that go into these products. As this industry grows, there's going to be a bigger and bigger need for feedstock, or the fuel that you need to feed these microbes in order for them to grow more efficiently. And I think there's another really interesting opportunity here in terms of building a marketplace for different types of feedstocks and looking beyond the traditional conventional feedstocks such as glucose, and looking to side streams and waste streams that could be utilized, and creating a circular bioeconomy for these microbes to utilize fuels that wouldn't otherwise be used and produce protein from very low cost feedstocks. On the R&D side, we touched on soy-like hemoglobin, and I showed there an example of how Impossible Foods identified heme as this critical molecule providing that meaty taste in a conventional beef burger, and then replicating that through fermentation technology. That's just one single example of a molecule that's important in these biosynthetic pathways that provide the different sensory attributes in a meat, egg, or dairy product. And there's a huge number of opportunities here to work with different microbes, targeting different molecules, different biosynthetic pathways to produce hundreds of these types of ingredients that can be incorporated into plant-based meat, egg, and dairy products to create that perfect sensory experience. And then finally, how can fermentation be used to enhance plant-based products? So many of you on this call have probably had a fermented product. They've been used for hundreds, if not thousands of years, right, to enhance the flavor, the sensory attributes of plants. Think about sauerkraut or kombucha or tempeh. And now think about how much this alternative protein industry is growing, the number of crops that we're starting to work with, and how we're processing those crops in different ways, how we're engineering them in different ways. And then think about the number of microbes that we're exploring and different ways to optimize those as well. And think about how those two can come together and be combined in novel ways to create different types of flavors using plant proteins and plant fats, but adding fermentation into that process. Really exciting opportunities. These four are just examples of some of the white space opportunities and ideas we've identified at GFI that are related to fermentation. We have a lot more that we'll be releasing in the next couple of months. And I'd encourage you to keep checking on our website to learn more about some of these really exciting fermentation-based ideas. But I hope this gives you an example of some of the ideas and how important and critical fermentation is going to be for this industry moving forward. If you do want to learn a bit more about some of the work that my team and others at GFI provide, I would encourage you to head on over to our resources page, where there's a lot more information on fermentation and all of the other technologies, plant-based and cultivated meat, that we analyze and write about. And with that, I will stop and say thank you so much for your attention. I'm happy to take as many questions as you have. You can also contact me, my email address there. And I think if you take a picture of that QR code, you should get all of my contact info, including my LinkedIn address if you'd like to connect. But Catherine, Gus, I'll hand it over to you and take questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, David. Great presentation, as always. Can you see the Q&A box,
Yes,
David?
I have it.
Yes. So would you mind to go through them?
Yes, David, just to give you a little context, the first question that we have here was sent in the slides that you had a few companies like Geltor and Perfect Day, showing companies that are already working with these technologies, okay? And just to say to everyone, some of the questions that were related like to Brazilian markets, consumer acceptance and stuff like this, I answered. And you can see the answer in the, we have the open questions and the answered questions here is in the Q&A. So I answered a couple ones that are already in the other section, okay? Go ahead, David, sorry.
No problem. The first question is, which of these companies are ready to put product on the market? Corn is already has products on the market. So there's already an example of success in this fermentation category for a number of years. The others seem to be moving very quickly. On the biomass side, it's not clear exactly when those new companies are going to launch commercial products, but I don't think it's very far off based on the prototypes that I've seen from them. On the precision fermentation or functional protein side, Geltor already have a product, but it's for the cosmetic market right now. But at least that shows that they're able to produce recombinant collagen and use it in products, albeit on the cosmetic side. So I think, again, it's really just a matter of time before Geltor and the other companies I mentioned have products specifically for the alternative protein market. So I think the next couple of years in the fermentation space are going to be really exciting with a lot of interesting new companies and product launches as well. Let's see, Junior asks, in the USA, GMO strain or the metabolites can be used in the food. Gus, you're going to take this one? Oh, no.
Sorry, I clicked when you answer because then I put it concluded and it moves the question out of the Q&A, okay?
Yeah. Yeah, I think, so I'm not a regulatory expert. It really, so so you can use microbes like this to produce recombinant proteins. I mentioned Geltor, who already have a cosmetic product on the market. I think it depends on the region. In the US, it does seem likely, but it depends on the ingredient itself and how similar it is to the product that's being replaced. So is it genetically identical or has it been modified in some way? And then I think the regulatory agencies will pay closer attention. But if I recall correctly, now I think it was Perfect Day just got GRAS certification for one of their dairy protein products, so which is a US in the US. So it looks good. At least that I think that's very exciting news because that work by Perfect Day will kind of pave the way for other companies to launch similar ingredients like that.
Dave, if I can just add something for the people that doesn't know, GRAS means generally recognized as safe. So it's a certification of safe to eat products like from the FDA. We have a few like also Impossible, which their heme products that is a new thing. So my perception is that you can sell the products, but you have to go through the novel ingredient regulatory process.
Thanks, Gus. The next question, are there any health problems by using these modified proteins? Is it safe? Well, I think, this is why regulatory bodies exist, to make sure that products and protein and ingredients are safe. If you're using recombinant protein technology in fermentation to produce an exact equivalent of an animal protein, then it will behave in exactly the same way and be as safe as the protein that came from the animal. But it is obviously up to the company and the regulatory agencies to establish tests and processes to ensure that the products are safe, which they are doing. Next one. Is the environmental impact with protein obtained by fermentation minor? So this is a great question, and I think there's still work that needs to be done to determine exactly what the environmental impact of these different methods will be. We are currently halfway through a new life cycle assessment for cultivated meat. And we would like to take the learnings from that and think about doing a similar type of study for fermentation. But what I can tell you is, at least from what we know about cultivated meat and using plant proteins, and then the use of fermentation technology in other parts of the food industry, and the products that corn already makes today that are on the market, that it is very likely that it will be far less of a negative impact to the environment than industrial animal agriculture production, particularly in terms of greenhouse gas emissions and water usage and pollution as well. Can transglutaminase be used for restructuring the plant protein, creating the meat-like structure? Yeah, in general, any type of enzyme that can restructure proteins can be used to modify plant proteins. The key is that you have to create the right type of cross linkage, the right types of protein modifications to create that that protein structure that resembles an animal protein and provides that texture. So in theory, yes, transglutaminase could be used, but there would need to be some experimentation to see if it has provides the right types of modifications to plant proteins. And not every plant protein will behave in the same way when transglutaminase is added as well. But it's an area that should be looked at, I think. Let's see. Silvana asks, what's your opinion about using wastes, e.g. glycerol from or lysate cells? Yes. I mentioned briefly in my presentation, I think that this is this is one of the white space ideas, and a really interesting one as well, is how can we use waste streams from other industries as fuel for microbes for fermentation? And can we modify can we either modify existing microbes that we use today for fermentation to metabolize these waste streams, or can we find microbes that we haven't yet used for protein production that that consume these types of waste streams as fuel? And this is work. So I showed on that slide with all the different companies, Solar Foods and Air Protein. Those are two examples of companies like that have identified bacteria that can consume CO2 as their primary fuel source, and then can convert that into protein that's then used as an ingredient. So I would encourage everyone on this meeting to think about like unused waste streams in the food industry or other industries that might be really powerful sources of fuel for this future industry. I think it's a really open area with a lot of opportunities. Looking for plant-based products, what are the major challenges for a company to implement fermentation in their process? Yeah, I think a lot of it's about scale up and identifying the right host organism to work with. So I think maybe starting from the end, right? So what is it that you're trying to do? Are you trying to create or provide a missing flavor or some other sensory attribute? Are you trying to modify the proteins and then work backwards from that? So figure out how much of it you'll need, and then what is the best process and the best microorganism to work with? What is the best feedstock to work with. If you remember back to one of my slides, a lot of this is going to be about cost, right? And so thinking about scale and cost as you think about how to integrate fermentation is going to be pretty critical. The advantage we have with fermentation is that it's an established industry. So as I mentioned in my presentation, we've used fermentation for a long time to produce, enzymes for the food industry like rennet and other proteins for the biopharma industry. So we know how to scale it up. So once you've figured out what it is you're trying to do and identified the right microorganism to work with, there are many companies that can help you scale. Someone asked about casein. Is there any product available? Not yet. So I showed you examples of I mentioned 3 companies, so Perfect Day, Legendary, and New Culture, who are all focused on using fermentation to produce recombinant casein and in some cases whey as well. But all of them are have not yet launched a product to the market. The one that has launched a prototype is Perfect Day that I mentioned, that they released a prototype ice cream last year, which was very tasty. Bruno asks, I would like to know if the formation and accumulation of bioactive amines such as histamine, tryptamine, and tyramine can be an issue to concern during the... Yeah, this is a great question that I think will depend on, I think it's potentially a challenge, but it will depend on the microorganism that's being used and the types of proteins that it produces, and also the feedstock that's being used. This is not, I'll be honest and say this is not an area of expertise for me, so I may not be giving you the most eloquent answer. I'm happy to connect with you offline and dive into it in more detail, but I think the power of using microbes like yeast and bacteria like E. coli is that one can engineer them, right, to ensure that you're not producing too much or too little of a particular type of amine, like the ones that you've mentioned here. They are inherently very flexible and powerful systems. But please shoot me an email if you'd like to discuss that more, or if I can connect you with people that know more about that than me. Mushroom mycelium liquid fermentation source biomass. Yeah, the companies I mentioned all use slightly different. I think you're asking about the source. You're either asking about the microorganism that they use, the particular strain, or the feedstock. And in all cases, each one is using a slightly different. They're using different microorganisms, so different types of filamentous fungi. They're all filamentous fungi, but each company, to my knowledge, is using a different strain, and their feedstocks are different as well, and some of that is proprietary. The most information you'll find that's published is on Korn's technology, so the particular type of fungi that they use is published, and you can read more about that online. And please shoot me an email if you'd like some links. Which essential amino acids are possible to produce through, well, essentially all of them. You can use fermentation to produce amino acids. In fact, many of the amino acids that you would buy from an ingredient supplier or even fed to livestock today, right? Because some of the feed that we feed livestock is deficient in some amino acids, and those are added to the feed, and many of those are produced through fermentation. So in theory, all are possible. DDGS from corn ethanol is currently sold to cattle and poultry. I'm not sure what DDGS is, Joao, so maybe you can, for like the sake of time, maybe send me an email and I can help you after the call. One of the big issues we see nowadays is that plant-based is seen for many people to be an ultra-processed alternative protein. How might this be addressed? Yeah, this is an important question. question. And I think one of the powers of fermentation, as I mentioned before, is that it can allow you to reduce the amount of processing that you might need to create the appropriate sensory attributes, right? So ingredients like hemoglobin or new types of ingredients like that might, instead of having to add like 4 or 5 different flavor enhancers, you might be able to just use one that's produced through fermentation technology. Or you might be able to use less processing to restructure the plant proteins, right? If you're using an enzyme or a combination of enzymes, you might not need
Estamos tendo um probleminha técnico aqui, pessoal. Acho que logo ele volta. David, we can't hear you anymore.
David, can you hear us?
Well, as David reconnects, I think I will answer the next question that is more about Brazil and the Brazilian political scenario. So, David, you want to know how to answer. So, okay, he's probably going to reconnect now. So I will speak in Portuguese because David is not in the room anymore. Pessoal, a respeito da parte política, né, tem uma pergunta: como que a gente traz esses produtos no Brasil? Porque é um mercado dominado pelos pecuaristas e é um mercado politicamente muito fechado. O GFI está tendo uma interlocução boa com o governo, apesar de, obviamente, existirem forças políticas que são contraditórias, digamos assim, no meio desse setor. A gente está conseguindo abertura para discutir a respeito disso. Então, se já tem alguma coisa acontecendo, uma iniciativa que vocês estão tentando fazer e que não está sendo possível por algum motivo, compartilha com a gente, manda uma mensagenzinha para a gente poder trabalhar com isso, e aí a gente ajuda vocês, ok? Sorry, David.
I got kicked off. I'm so sorry. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes, we can.
Okay.
I think that maybe we have time for more 2 questions, David.
Okay. Let's see. I'm trying to find the Q&A again. 1 second.
Yeah, so everyone that is not having their question answered, please send the question to us and we will be glad to answer. You can share the questions with Catherine or David directly and we will be happy to answer everyone, okay?
Yeah, I'll take, yes, please email me and connect with me offline. I'm happy to answer more questions. I see one here. What about using cultivated or fermentation technology to create a completely new meat type with a higher completeness score, amino acid score? Yeah, absolutely, right? This is the power of this industry, is that we don't have to stop with getting to 100% equivalence with, say, conventional beef or chicken or seafood. We can go beyond that and create new flavor and nutritional experiences that we've never had before, right? So the same texture or better texture, but with less fat content or lower sodium. So yeah, this is what we're already seeing with companies like Impossible Foods and Beyond Meat, where they're already on their next version, right, of their product. They're not stopping at version 1, they're continuing to improve and improve. Really great question. Let's see, I'm gonna pick one more. Lots of questions about amino acids. Yeah, and I think I've answered this. So, you know, how do we get the balance of amino acids right? This is how you can find the right host strain and engineer it, right, to produce the right balance of amino acids. This is really the power of fermentation technology, is that it allows you to tweak and optimize so that you're getting a both functional protein out that provides the right type of texture, the right type of aroma and sensory experience, but also be optimal nutritionally. Let's see, one last one. Yeah, fermentation, is it not a more expensive process? So it could be, but like I mentioned in my presentation, it's really about how much of the ingredient you need in the final product, right? So if you need a lot, then it's likely to be an expensive end product. But if you're using it in small amounts and you're optimizing the microorganism and the feedstock so that you're lowering the costs and making the process more and more efficient, this is how the costs are going to continue to come down. So from everything I've seen, I'm very optimistic that in many cases, not every case, but in many cases, we'll be able to produce proteins that will create better plant-based meat, egg and dairy products, better cultivated meat products, and help bring the price down as well. Is that a good place to end, Catherine, with an optimistic viewpoint?
Definitely it is, David. Yes. So, David, once again, thank you so much for an enlightening and entertaining presentation. So there were lots of questions, so our participants saw value in the information that you shared with us. So thank you. And a special thank you to our participants. GFI Brazil is absolutely delighted to have each and every one of us today for our first webinar. Hope to see you all in June, and stay safe and have a great week. Obrigada. Boa semana.
Obrigado pela participação. Eu deixei aqui o e-mail de contato da Caterine, caterinem@gfi.org. Então, todas as perguntas que não foram respondidas, a gente tem 10 perguntas aqui ainda sem responder. Por favor, encaminhe para a Caterine, porque a gente perde aqui no Q&A, ele não registra o e-mail de quem mandou a pergunta, a gente não consegue responder. Então, por favor, repitam a pergunta para a Caterine, que a gente vai pegar uma resposta para todo mundo. E muito obrigado pela presença. David, thank you very much for being here with us today.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.